The courthouse always smelled the same, a mix of old paper, floor wax, and the faint metallic scent of anxiety that clung to the air like humidity. For 22-year-old Alara, it had become the soundtrack to her days. The shuffle of expensive shoes on polished marble, the low murmur of hushed conversations, the sudden, sharp crack of a gavel that could make a whole room jump. As a file clerk, she was practically invisible, a ghost in the machine of justice. People saw the gray blazer she wore to look professional, the neat bun she kept her dark hair in, and the glasses that sometimes slid down her nose. They didn't see the mind behind her eyes, a mind that had been secretly filing away legal precedents and procedural rules since she was 16. She wasn't just a clerk. She was a student in the world's most exclusive and unforgiving library. Her corner of the world was a dim basement room, stacked ceiling high with case files that smelled of dust and forgotten stories. But for Alara, each box was a treasure chest. During her lunch breaks, while others ate sandwiches in the park, she would pull a file, not just to categorize it, but to dissect it. She'd read the arguments, trace the logic, and see how the law was a living, breathing thing. It was a secret passion, a hunger born from a place of pain. When she was 12, her family had lost their small bakery in a lawsuit so convoluted and expensive that they simply ran out of money to keep fighting. She remembered the helplessness in her father's eyes, the way her mother's hands would tremble as she sorted through bills they couldn't pay. The law hadn't been their shield. It had been a weapon used against them. So, Alara had made a quiet promise to herself. She would never feel that helpless again. She would understand the rules of the game, even if she wasn't allowed on the field. That promise came calling on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. She was walking home, the crisp air a welcome change from the stuffy courthouse basement, when she passed the home of Mrs. Gable, a sweet, widowed woman in her late 70s who grew the most spectacular roses on their street. But tonight, something was wrong. The living room curtains, usually drawn just so, were pulled tight, and a single, frantic light was on. A knot of worry tightened in Alara's stomach. She knocked on the door. After a long moment, she heard the shuffling of slippers and the click of the lock. Mrs. Gable opened the door. Her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy from crying. "Alara, dear," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here." Alara stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender and baking cookies replaced by a heavy, fearful silence. On the small, lace-covered coffee table lay a thick envelope with a bold, intimidating logo. Next to it was a letter, already crumpled from Mrs. Gable's grip. "What is it, Mrs. Gable? What happened?" The older woman sank into her floral armchair, looking small and defeated. "It's the property management company. The one that took over from old Mr. Henderson? They're suing me." Lara picked up the letter. Her eyes, trained by years of scanning dense legal documents, scanned the dense paragraphs. It was a complaint, filled with scary words like breach of contract and damages. The core issue was absurdly simple. They claimed Mrs. Gable's prize-winning rose bush had extended 2 inches over a shared walkway, supposedly causing a trip hazard and demanding $5,000 in remediation and legal fees. It was a ridiculous claim, designed to scare an old woman into paying a smaller but still significant settlement fee. "It was legal bullying, I don't understand," Mrs. Gable said, wringing her hands. "I've had that rose bush for 30 years. Mr. Henderson never said a word. They sent me this monster of a letter, and when I called to explain, they just told me to wait for our attorney's communication. I can't afford a lawyer, dear. I barely afford my groceries." Lara looked at the woman's kind, terrified face, and then back at the letter. She saw the same helplessness she had seen in her own parents' eyes all those years ago. The system was once again being used as a club against someone who couldn't fight back. But this time, Alara was standing right there. This time, maybe things could be different. Her secret knowledge didn't have to stay in the basement. "Don't you worry about this," Alara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She placed a reassuring hand on Mrs. Gable's shoulder. "We will figure this out. I may not be a lawyer, but I work in a court. I know how things work. Let me help you. I can be your friend and advisor. You can represent yourself, but I'll be right there next to you to help you understand what's happening." A flicker of hope, faint but real, lit up in Mrs. Gable's eyes. Over the next week, that's what they did. Ilara spent her evenings in the courthouse library, legally accessible to the public. She found precedents where similar nuisance lawsuits had been thrown out of court. She learned the exact procedural rules for a small claims hearing, the right way to address a judge, and the specific questions to ask the company's representative to expose the weakness of their case. She compiled a neat binder of notes, not for herself, but for Mrs. Gable to study. The old woman looked at the neat pages as if they were written in a foreign language, but she trusted Ilara. She trusted the calm confidence that had replaced the young woman's usual quiet demeanor. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse felt different from the other side of the bench. It wasn't a place of quiet observation anymore. It was an arena. Mrs. Gable, dressed in her best Sunday church dress, clutched Ilara's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Ilara had worn her simple gray blazer, but had let her hair down. It was a small act, but it made her feel more like herself and less like a clerk. She had no official standing. She was just a friend. But in her heart, she was a soldier walking into battle. Armed with nothing but paper and knowledge, they entered the small courtroom and took their seats at the plain wooden table for the defendants. Across from them, a young man in a suit that looked too expensive for a small claims case sat smugly shuffling his papers. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed, a dark, imposing wall of wood. The judge himself, a man named Harrington, had a reputation. He was older, with silver hair, a severe face, and zero tolerance for what he considered a waste of the court's time. He had been a prosecutor for decades and carried himself like a general who had seen too many battles and had no time for new recruits. He swept into the room, his black robes flowing behind him. The court clerk called all rise, and the room stiffened to attention. Judge Harrington didn't sit immediately. He stood, scanning the room with a cold, appraising gaze. His eyes passed over the cocky corporate lawyer, then over the nervous, trembling Mrs. Gable. Then they landed on Ilara. He saw a young woman, barely out of her teens, sitting next to the defendant. He saw no law degree, no bar association pin, no air of formal authority. He saw exactly what the world saw: a simple girl, a friend, maybe a granddaughter, who had no business being in a courtroom. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He was already predisposed to dislike this case, to see it as the petty bickering it was. The sight of this untrained person only solidified his belief that this was going to be a complete waste of his morning. He didn't know her name, her story, or the fire that was burning in her mind. All he saw was a problem. And for the first time in her young, quiet life, Ilara Jensen felt the full, targeted weight of a man's power and his immediate, unwavering contempt. The game was about to begin. The courtroom was a small, drab room with brown wooden paneling that seemed to absorb all the light, making it feel more like a basement than a place of justice. The air was still and heavy. Judge Harrington settled onto his high-backed chair. Looking down at the two parties as if they were insects he was about to study, he didn't even bother with a polite opening. He tapped his pen on the desk, a sharp, impatient sound that made Mrs. Gable flinch each time. "All right," he said, his voice like gravel. "Let's get this nonsense over with. Plaintiff, state your case." The young lawyer from the property management company, a man whose smile didn't reach his eyes, stood up. He was smooth and practiced, speaking in loud, confident terms about contractual obligations and property liability. He painted Mrs. Gable not as a sweet old lady who loved flowers, but as a negligent and stubborn individual who willfully defied the rules, putting the entire community at risk with her dangerous rosebush. He held up a large photograph of the offending plant, making 2 inches of growth look like a monstrous invasion. Mrs. Gable tried to interject, her voice small and shaky. "But it's just a rosebush. ... It's been there for," she would start. But the lawyer would smoothly talk over her, and Judge Harrington would just wave a dismissive hand in her direction. Ilara sat beside Mrs. Gable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She had prepared Mrs. Gable for this. She had given her the key points, the questions to ask. But watching it unfold was different. The lawyer's confidence was a weapon, and the judge's impatient scowl was his shield. Mrs. Gable, overwhelmed and intimidated, kept forgetting the simple lines they had rehearsed. She was a gardener, not a fighter. The grand, scary stage of the courtroom had stolen her voice. When it was their turn, Mrs. Gable stood up. But all she could do was repeat, "It's not fair. I don't understand." This was the moment Alara had been waiting for. She knew she couldn't speak for her, but maybe she could guide her. Leaning over, she whispered, "Remember the document we found? The original property deed? Ask him about the easement language." Mrs. Gable took a shaky breath and tried, "Your Honor, the document." Before she could get another word out, a loud bang echoed through the room. Judge Harrington had slammed his gavel down, making Mrs. Gable jump and nearly fall back into her chair. The judge's face was a mask of fury, his eyes locked not on Mrs. Gable, but on Alara. "You," he snarled, pointing his gavel directly at her. "Who are you? What do you think you're doing?" "I'm a friend, Your Honor," Alara said, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. "I'm just trying to help Mrs. Gable present her case. This is not a knitting circle," the judge roared, his voice dripping with a venomous sarcasm that made Alara's cheeks burn with heat. "This is a court of law. It is a place for officers of the court, for trained professionals, for lawyers. Not for unqualified, chatty children giving sideline advice." He looked at the other lawyer and gave a slight, knowing smirk. The lawyer's smile widened. They were on the same team. Alara felt a hot wave of humiliation wash over her. The word child stung more than any insult. All her secret studies, all the hours spent in the dusty basement library, all felt like a silly fantasy in that moment. Here in this room, she was nothing. He had reduced her to an annoying kid. She wanted to shrink down in her seat and disappear. The judge wasn't finished. "You will remain silent. If you speak out of turn one more time, I will have you removed from this courtroom and held in contempt. Do you understand me?" Alara could only nod, her throat tight. She looked over at Mrs. Gable, whose face was now ashen with terror. The judge's outburst had completely shattered what little confidence she had left. The hearing continued. And it was a massacre. The judge allowed the property lawyer to say anything he wanted, no matter how exaggerated or irrelevant. When Mrs. Gable tried to speak, the judge would cut her off. "Relevance," he would snap, "or get to the point, madame," was rushing her, pressuring her, silencing her. It wasn't a hearing. It was an execution. Alara sat in silence, but her mind was working not out of fear anymore, but out of a cold, hard anger. She watched everything. She saw the way the judge nodded at the property lawyer's arguments, the way he sighed dramatically whenever Mrs. Gable spoke, the way he treated the entire proceeding as a personal inconvenience at one point. The property lawyer made a claim that was completely untrue. He stated that a specific city ordinance, which he cited by number, required all walkways to be completely clear of any and all foliage. Alara knew this was a lie. She had looked up that very ordinance. It was about preventing overgrown shrubs from blocking street signs, not about prize-winning rose bushes. Her legal training, her real, hard-earned knowledge kicked in. An objection. A lawyer would stand and say, "Objection, Your Honor, misstatement of fact." She knew she couldn't do that, but maybe she could hand Mrs. Gable a note. Quickly, she scribbled on her notepad, "He is wrong about the ordinance. Tell the judge." She discreetly slid the note over to Mrs. Gable, who glanced down at it. The old woman, seeing a chance to fight back, found a tiny spark of courage. She stood up a little straighter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. "He is wrong about that city rule. It's about—" Before she could finish, Judge Harrington's eyes locked onto Alara again. He had seen the note. He saw the movement. He didn't even let Mrs. Gable finish her sentence. "That is it," he bellowed, his face turning a shade of red that bordered on purple. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara.
"I'll warn you.
Bailiff, remove this young woman from my courtroom immediately. I will not tolerate this disruptive behavior." A uniformed bailiff. A kind-faced man who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. started walking towards their table. Mrs. Gable looked at Alara with wide, horrified eyes, silently begging her not to cause any more trouble. For a split second, Alara thought about fighting it. She thought about standing up for herself, for her right to be there. But looking at Mrs. Gable's terrified face, she knew she couldn't. It would only make things worse for her friend. "I'll go," Alara said softly to the bailiff. "I'm sorry." She wasn't sure who she was apologizing to, Mrs. Gable, the bailiff, or herself, as she stood up to leave. The judge delivered his final, cruel blow. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice booming, directed at her. "You cannot learn the law from watching television or reading a few books. This is a serious profession. Go back to school, or better yet, go find a profession more suited to your... obvious limitations." A few people in the gallery snickered. The property lawyer actually chuckled. Every word felt like a physical blow. Obvious limitations. The shame was so intense it was almost nauseating. She walked out of the courtroom, her head held low, the bailiff's firm but gentle hand on her elbow. She didn't look back. She could hear the judge's voice continuing as he announced his decision. He was ruling in favor of the property management company, of course. He was ordering Mrs. Gable to pay the $5,000. The bully had one. Alara stood in the hallway, the sounds of the courtroom muffled behind the heavy wooden doors. The humiliation was still there, a hot, prickling feeling all over her skin. But as she stood there, alone in the quiet, polished corridor, the shame began to cool. It didn't disappear, but it was being replaced by something else. Something harder, colder, and much more powerful. It was the memory of the judge's smirk, the sound of the other lawyer's chuckle, the image of Mrs. Gable's defeated face. He hadn't just dismissed her. He had mocked her passion, her intelligence, and her very right to seek justice. And he had done it all while breaking the most important rule of all. A judge must be impartial. He hadn't just been mean. He had been biased. And in that moment, the clerk from the basement decided she wasn't just going to accept it. She was going to find out why. The sound of the heavy courthouse door closing behind her was like the sound of a prison cell locking. Alara walked down the long marble hallway, her footsteps the only sound echoing in the vast, empty space. Each step felt heavy, weighted down with the judge's words. Obvious limitations. The phrase replayed in her mind, a cruel looping soundtrack to her shame. She had never felt so small, so foolish. All those nights spent reading, all that secret pride in her knowledge, had been crushed in a matter of minutes by a man with a gavel and a deep-seated contempt for anyone he deemed. Beneath him, she didn't go home right away. Instead, she found herself walking aimlessly through the city's streets as dusk began to settle. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her. She watched couples laughing as they walked into restaurants, and groups of friends chatting happily on their way to a night out. Their worlds felt so simple, so far removed from the cold, predatory reality she had just witnessed. A wave of despair washed over her. What had she even been thinking, trying to take on the legal system? The judge was right. She was just a clerk. A girl with some books and a dangerous amount of overconfidence. When she finally walked into her small apartment, the silence was deafening. It wasn't a comforting silence. It was an accusing one. The stack of legal books on her coffee table seemed to stare at her, their titles a reminder of her failure. She slumped onto her worn-out sofa, the fight draining out of her completely. She could still see the look on Mrs. Gable's face when she had been led away by the bailiff pure terror. The thought that she had caused that sweet woman even more distress was a fresh stab of guilt. Maybe the best thing to do was to call Mrs. Gable, apologize, and just fade back into the background where she belonged. Maybe that was the lesson. She was about to pick up the phone to do just that, when a different memory surfaced. It wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't the judge's insults. It was the look on the judge's face when he had seen the note. It wasn't just anger. It was something else. It was fear. A quick flash of panic before he covered it with more bluster and fury. And the other lawyer, the smug one in the expensive suit, the way the judge had looked at him, the little shared smirks, It wasn't just a judge being annoyed by a civilian. It felt coordinated. It felt like they were on the same team, playing a game where the winner was already decided. Why? The question hung in the air of her quiet apartment. Why would a judge, a man with a secure, powerful job, care so much about a tiny $5,000 lawsuit? A man like Judge Harrington dealt with million-dollar corporate disputes and life-and-death criminal cases. This case was beneath him, a fly he should have swatted away without a second thought. Instead, he had engaged with a level of personal viciousness that was completely out of proportion. Her tired mind, which had been ready to give up, suddenly clicked back on. It was a small gear turning at first, slowly, but it was turning. It wasn't just about bias. Bias is having a bad day and disliking someone's attitude. This was different. This felt active, purposeful. Her curiosity, the very thing that had led her to love the law in the first place, began to overshadow her shame. She pushed herself off the sofa and walked over to her books. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew how to find things. It was, after all, her job. She turned on her old slow laptop. Her hands felt clumsy at first, but a new energy was flowing through her. If she couldn't fight him in the courtroom, she could research him in the digital world. She started with the basics, public records. It was something she had learned to navigate for her job, pulling up old case files and property deeds. But now, she was looking for something different. She started with the property management company. Their lawsuit against Mrs. Gable felt like a tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. She typed their name into a business database, the screen filled with information. The company was called Urban Vista Properties. It sounded official. But as she dug deeper, she found that they were just a small part of something much bigger. They were a subsidiary, a small branch of a massive tree. She followed the digital trail, clicking through shell companies and holding corporations until she found the root. A real estate development conglomerate named Northstone Holdings. Northstone was a big player in the city, known for buying up old properties, tearing them down, and building expensive new condos. They had a lot of money and a lot of power. Okay, so a big company owned the little company that was suing Mrs. Gable. That wasn't illegal. Big corporations were complex, but it still didn't explain the judge. So she kept digging. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her earlier despair replaced by a laser-like focus. She started searching for connections between Northstone Holdings and anyone involved in the city's legal system. She searched for campaign donations to judges, for business partnerships, for anything. For 2 hours, she found nothing. It was a dead end. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The old feeling of foolishness started to creep back in. She was chasing ghosts, seeing conspiracies where there were none. The judge was just a jerk. The company was just greedy, and Mrs. Gable was just unlucky. That's all there was to it. She was about to close the laptop when a different kind of search idea popped into her head. It was a long shot. She went to the city's public financial disclosures website. It was a clunky, poorly designed portal full of scanned PDFs that were often hard to read. It was supposed to contain the financial interests of high-level public officials, including judges, to prevent the exact kind of corruption she was starting to suspect. But the records were often buried under vague descriptions and confusing legal jargon. It's designed to be opaque. She typed in Judge Harrington's name. The first few documents were what you'd expect. Mutual funds, a retirement account, some shares in well-known companies like Apple and Ford. They were all standard. Diversified investments that didn't raise any red flags. She was about to give up for the night, her body aching with fatigue, when she decided to check one more file, a supplemental disclosure from the previous year. The PDF was slow to load, and when it did, it was just a messy, scanned image of a handwritten form. Most of it was illegible. But as she was about to close it, one line caught her eye. It was a section for other investments. Underneath, written in the judge's neat, precise handwriting, were the words, Limited Partnership, Pine Grove Development. Pine Grove Development. The name didn't mean anything to her, but something about it felt familiar. She quickly opened a new tab and searched for Pine Grove Development and Northstone Holdings. A news article from 3 years ago popped up. The headline read, "Northstone Holdings acquires Pine Grove development in major city expansion." Her heart started to pound against her ribs like a drum. She read the article, her eyes scanning the words so fast she was barely reading them. The article explained that Pine Grove Development was a private real estate investment firm, and that its acquisition had given Northstone Holdings a controlling interest in dozens of new commercial and residential projects in the city. She went back to the judge's disclosure form. It didn't say how much his investment was, but it listed him as a limited partner. That meant he wasn't just an employee, he was an owner. He had a financial stake in the company's success. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the force of a lightning strike. The property management company suing Mrs. Gable, Urban Vista Properties. She went back to their corporate profile. It had been created just 2 years ago. And who was one of its first major clients for property maintenance and security? Northstone Holdings. It was all connected. A judge who owned a piece of a massive development company was presiding over a case brought by that company's subsidiary. It wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was a textbook case of judicial corruption. He wasn't just protecting a friend. He was protecting his own money. The humiliation she had felt earlier vanished, completely burned away by a cold, clear fire of rage. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't even just about Mrs. Gable. This was about the fundamental principle of fairness. Judge Harrington had taken a sacred oath to be impartial, to be a neutral arbiter of justice. He had spat on that oath for a few $1,000s. He had used his power, a power given to him by the people, to line his own pockets. Alara looked out her small window at the dark city, the lights twinkling innocently. But she knew now that there was a darkness behind those lights, a corruption that festered in the very halls meant to dispense justice. She was no longer a scared girl who had been told she had limitations. She was the only person who knew the truth, and looking at the evidence on her screen, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled over her. She wouldn't just tell Mrs. Gable. She wouldn't just file a complaint that might be ignored. She was going to use the judge's own courtroom against him. He wanted to play a game. She had just learned the rules, and she was going to win. The morning sun felt different. When Alara woke up, the usual grogginess was replaced by a current of pure, focused energy. The shame from the previous day was gone, evaporated by the cold, hard facts she had uncovered in the middle of the night. She had printed out the key documents, the judge's financial disclosure, the news article about the Northstone acquisition, and the corporate profile linking the property company to Northstone. They sat in a neat stack on her kitchen table, not as evidence of a crime, but as tools. For the first time, she wasn't just a student of the law. She was a strategist. She and Mrs. Gable had an agreement to meet before the hearing. When Alara arrived at the little house, she found the older woman sitting in her armchair, staring out the window, a look of deep despair on her face. A letter from the court was on the table, confirming the $5,000 judgment. "Oh, Alara," Mrs. Gable said, her voice hollow. "It's over. We lost. I'm going to have to sell the car. I don't know how I'm going to manage." She looked at Alara with pained eyes. "I'm so sorry you got in trouble because of me. That judge was just awful." Alara pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of her, taking her frail hands in hers. "Mrs. Gable, listen to me. It is not over. We did not lose. We just started the real fight." Over the next hour, Alara laid out her plan. She didn't reveal the full, shocking truth about the judge's corruption. She didn't want to overwhelm or frighten her. Instead, she framed it as a new legal strategy. "The judge was biased," she explained calmly. "He was not fair to us. The law gives us the right to challenge that. Today we aren't going to talk about the rosebush. Today we are going to talk about fairness. You don't have to say much. Just let me handle the questions. Can you trust me?" Looking into Alara's steady, confident eyes, Mrs. Gable saw not the scared girl from the day before, but a woman transformed. There was a strength in her that was undeniable. The old woman slowly nodded, a flicker of the same hope from a week ago returning, but this time it was stronger. Walking back into that courtroom was like walking into a lion's den a second time. But this time, Ilara felt like she was carrying a concealed weapon. The judge was already on his bench when they entered, his face a stony mask of impatience. The property lawyer was there too, looking smug, ready to wrap things up. He shot a dismissive glance at Ilara, clearly expecting her to be silent. The courtroom was a little fuller today. A few other lawyers waiting for their own cases were lingering in the gallery. Curious to see the end of the drama they had witnessed yesterday, Judge Harrington didn't even wait for them to be seated. All right, we are here for the finalization of the judgment. Counsel for the plaintiff, are you prepared to proceed? Your Honor, a clear, steady voice cut through the room. Everyone turned. It was Ilara standing up. She wasn't shouting. Her voice was calm and respectful, but it carried an authority that made everyone stop what they were doing. Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed. I thought I made myself clear yesterday, he growled. You did, Your Honor, Ilara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. And I have no intention of disrupting these proceedings. I am simply exercising my right to be heard on a matter of procedure before the court before a final judgment is entered. A murmur went through the gallery. This was not the same girl from yesterday. The judge looked taken aback. He couldn't just throw her out for that. It was a perfectly legitimate request. Proceed, he said, the word clipped and angry. Ilara turned her attention to the smug property lawyer. Sir, I would like to ask you a few questions about your client. Urban Vista Properties. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant. The case has been decided. The objection is noted, Ilara said smoothly, turning back to the judge. But I am not questioning the verdict, Your Honor. I am questioning the standing of the plaintiff to even bring this suit and their possible motive. It is highly relevant to the court's ability to dispense justice. The judge didn't like it, but he couldn't legally deny her the right to question. Let her speak, he snapped, clearly annoyed. Sir, Ilara continued, her voice still calm. Urban Vista Properties has only been in existence for 2 years. Is that correct? That's our understanding, yes, the lawyer said, looking confused. And in those 2 years, its primary function has been to manage properties acquired by its parent corporation. Northstone Holdings, is that also correct? The lawyer's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I am not aware of the full business dealings of our parent company. I see, Ilara said. Then let me ask you this. In your complaint, you state that Mrs. Gable's rosebush is a trip hazard, yet in the past 5 years, there have been 0 reported incidents or injuries from this alleged hazard. Can you explain why a company is spending thousands of dollars in legal fees to pursue a trip hazard that has never, in fact, caused a trip? The lawyer started to sputter. We are acting proactively to ensure the safety of the community. How noble, Ilara said, her voice tinged with just the right amount of skepticism. And is it also proactive for Northstone Holdings, your parent company, to have filed over 200 similar small claims lawsuits against elderly residents in the last 3 years, often for minor, unverifiable violations, and settling 95% of them out of court for amounts just under the cost of hiring a lawyer? The entire courtroom was silent now. The lawyers in the gallery were leaning forward, their eyes wide. This was no longer about a rose bush. Judge Harrington's face was starting to turn red. He was losing control of the narrative. The property lawyer looked trapped. I would not have that information. Of course you wouldn't, Ilara said softly. She then turned to face Judge Harrington directly. Your Honor, we do not believe this is a legitimate legal action. We believe this is a pattern of behavior. A pattern of using the court system to intimidate and financially pressure longtime residents, many of them elderly and on fixed incomes, to sell their homes to Northstone Holdings at below market value. This is not a lawsuit. It is a business tactic, and it is being aided by a judge who refuses to allow the defendant to present a defense. Could have heard a pin drop. It was a direct public accusation. Judge Harrington was on his feet, his face purple with rage. That is enough. You are out of order. I will hold you in contempt. But Ilara wasn't finished. She had one final piece of ammunition. Your Honor, she said, her voice dropping to a quieter, more serious tone, A judge's duty is to be impartial. The Code of Conduct is very clear on this. A judge must recuse himself from any case in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Would you say that owning a significant financial stake in a company's success would reasonably question your impartiality in a case brought by that company? The judge froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted around the room, panicked. He knew what she was referring to. He was trapped. He couldn't deny the ownership without committing perjury. But to admit it was to admit his guilt. Alara let the silence hang in the air, thick and suffocating. Then she turned to the court clerk. I am formally requesting a short recess, 15 minutes, so that I may file a motion with the court. A motion for what? The judge finally managed to choke out. Alara looked him straight in the eye. A motion for your recusal, Your Honor, and for a mistrial due to judicial misconduct. The courtroom erupted in gasps. The judge looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He stared at Alara, his face a storm of fury and fear. He had completely underestimated this simple girl. He had tormented her, mocked her, and tried to crush her, not knowing he was arming his own destroyer. He slammed the gavel down, not with authority, but with panicked frustration. Out. Recess granted. He bellowed, and without another word, he stood up and fled from the bench, disappearing into his chambers. Alara slowly sat down. Mrs. Gable was looking at her, her mouth open in shock. The lawyers in the gallery were staring at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had done it. She hadn't just defended her friend. She had exposed the rot at the heart of the system. And she had done it using the very rules he had used to try to silence her. The checkmate was not far away now. The 15-minute recess felt like an hour. The courtroom, which had been a place of dread and then a battlefield, was now a buzzing hive of whispered conversations. No one dared to leave. They all sat, transfixed by the young woman in the simple gray blazer and the elderly woman beside her. The property lawyer, who had been so smug just minutes before, was now pale and sweating, talking frantically into his phone. He looked less like a shark and more like a minnow who had just seen a fishing boat. The other lawyers in the gallery watched Alara with a new kind of respect, a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine amazement. They had all seen Judge Harrington bully people for years. None of them had ever seen someone stand up to him like that, let alone back him into a corner. Alara sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wasn't thinking about the drama she had just created. She was focusing on the next step. The motion for recusal was more than just a legal document. It was a public declaration of war. She had printed it out before they came to court, a neatly typed 4-page document that laid out the case, point by point, with the evidence attached in a clear appendix. She had prepared for this moment as if it were the most important exam of her life. Mrs. Gable leaned over, her voice a trembling whisper. My goodness, child. What did you just do? They're all staring. Lara gave her a small, reassuring smile. I just asked him to play by the rules, Mrs. Gable. That's all. The heavy wooden door to the judge's chambers swung open, and everyone fell silent. Judge Harrington walked back into the courtroom, but he was not the same man. The arrogant, thundering presence was gone. He moved with a heavy stiffness, his shoulders slumped, his face a pale, sickly gray. He looked 10 years older. He avoided looking at Alara, his eyes fixed on his desk as if it were a life raft. The courtroom wasn't his domain anymore. It was his cage. He didn't sit down. He stood by his chair and spoke, his voice flat and devoid of all its previous power. In light of the issues raised by the defense, and due to a pre-existing personal matter of which I was not previously aware, I am recusing myself from this case, effective immediately. A collective intake of breath filled the room. This was it. This was the public surrender. No one had even had to file the motion yet. The mere threat of it, the knowledge that Alara had the proof, had been enough to make him fall on his own sword. He continued, his voice cracking slightly. This case will be reassigned to Judge Miller in courtroom for B. She is waiting for you now. With that, he turned and almost fled from the room, his black robes trailing behind him like a flag of defeat. He didn't look back. He was gone, A wave of relief washed over the room, so palpable it felt like a change in air pressure. Mrs. Gable started to cry. This time they were tears of joy and disbelief. She wrapped her arms around Alara, hugging her tightly. "You did it," she whispered over and over. "You saved my home?" The bailiff approached their table, a broad, warm smile on his kind face. "Judge Miller is ready for you, ladies." Good luck. The new courtroom was like stepping into a different world. Judge Miller was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense but welcoming demeanor. The room itself was brighter, and the atmosphere was one of calm order, not tense hostility. The property lawyer, looking utterly defeated, meekly repeated the same arguments he had made before, but they sounded hollow and ridiculous without Judge Harrington's bias to prop them up. Judge Miller listened patiently. Then she turned to Alara. "Miss, you have something to add?" Alara stood up. "Your Honor, we believe this case is frivolous and should be dismissed. The plaintiff has provided no evidence of actual harm, and given the vast resources of their parent corporation, it is clear their intent is not to seek justice but to harass an elderly homeowner." Judge Miller looked at the lawyer, who just shrugged, defeated. Then she looked at the file, and then at the trembling but hopeful Mrs. Gable. She didn't need any more convincing. "Court finds for the defendant," she said, her voice clear and firm. "The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff is hereby ordered to cover all court costs. Case closed." Just like that, it was over. No more drama, no more bullying. The truth, once uncovered, had won. As they walked out of the second courtroom into the bright sunlight of the afternoon, Lara felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. They had won. The good guys had won. But the story didn't end there. As they were leaving the courthouse, a well-dressed man in his 30s, one of the lawyers who had been watching from the gallery, hurried to catch up with them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I'm sorry to bother you, but what you did in there was the most masterful piece of courtroom strategy I have ever seen. I'm a junior partner at a firm downtown, and we handle a lot of pro bono work. I've never seen anything like it." Lara felt a blush creep up her neck. "I just did some reading." "No," the man said, shaking his head. "You didn't just read. You understood? You saw the game for what it was, and you changed the rules. That's a real lawyer's mind right there. Listen, our firm has an opening for a paralegal, but frankly, that would be a waste of your talent. I want to bring you in as a legal apprentice. We'll pay for your night classes, get you on the path to your degree, and the bar exam. You belong in a courtroom, not in a basement." Mrs. Gable beamed, squeezing Alira's arm. "You see? I told you." Alara was speechless. All those secret years of study, all the lonely nights spent poring over dusty books, had just led to this. An offer, a path, a future. It felt like a dream. Yes, she finally managed to say. "I would like that very much." A few weeks later, Alara started her new job. Her small apartment, with its worn-out sofa and stack of library books, was replaced with a cubicle in a bustling law firm, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet hum of industry. She was no longer invisible. She was a legal apprentice, learning from experienced attorneys, doing real research, and helping real people. Her first assignment was to help another elderly couple fight an eviction from a predatory landlord. This time, she had business cards and the full backing of a law firm. Word of what she had done had spread through the legal community like wildfire. The whispers about Judge Harrington's conflict of interest grew louder, and an official judicial review was launched. He quietly retired before any formal charges could be brought, but his reputation was ruined. He was no longer a feared figure. He was a cautionary tale. One evening, a few months later, Alara was leaving the office, a heavy briefcase full of case files in her hand. As she walked out of the skyscraper, she saw Mrs. Gable waiting for her on the sidewalk, a fragrant bouquet of her prize-winning roses in her hands. "I thought you might need some cheering up," the old woman said with a wink. "They're a new breed. I'm calling them Alaras. They're tough, beautiful, and they refuse to be stepped on." Lara took the flowers, their sweet scent filling the air. She looked at the woman she had helped, and then at the impressive building behind her, a symbol of the new life she was building. She thought back to the scared girl in the basement, the humiliated girl in the courtroom, and the fierce strategist who had brought a powerful man to his knees. She was only 22 years old, but she had learned that the law wasn't just about books and rules. It was about courage. It was about standing up for the voiceless, even when your own voice was shaking. It was about believing that justice wasn't just a word on a courthouse wall, a living, breathing thing worth fighting for. And as she walked home through the city lights, holding her bouquet of defiant, beautiful roses, she knew she had found exactly where she was meant to be.